There is a specific suffocating kind of silence that falls over a ballroom when the social order is violently disrupted. Picture the glittering chandeliers of Harrington Manor casting a cold light on the wealthiest elite in London, all of them sneering at a woman in a modest green dress who had dared to arrive alone. They laughed openly, spilling vintage champagne as they mocked her isolation, stripping her of her dignity piece by piece. But the cruel laughter died in their throats the moment the heavy mahogany doors swung violently open. The notoriously reclusive Duke of Westmoreland had arrived not for the hostess, not for the desperate heiresses, but for the very woman they had just humiliated. And the secret he brought with him was about to shatter their world entirely. To understand the sheer magnitude of the scandal that erupted at the Harrington Winter Gala, one must first understand Fiona Jenkins. Fiona was not born into money, nor did she care for the frivolous pursuits of high society. At 32, she was a senior archivist and provenance researcher at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Her life was defined by the scent of aging parchment, the quiet hum of the climate-controlled archives, and the meticulous unraveling of historical mysteries. She spent her days tracing the lineage of stolen art, returning lost legacies to their rightful heirs. She was comfortable in her anonymity content to live in her small, drafty flat in Jericho, surrounded by towering stacks of books and half-finished cups of Earl Grey tea. The disruption of her peaceful life arrived on a crisp Tuesday morning in the form of a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with crimson wax. The seal bore the crest of the Harrington family, one of the oldest and most ruthlessly snobbish aristocratic families in England. Inside was an invitation to the Harrington Winter Gala, an exclusive invite-only affair held at their sprawling estate in Mayfair. It was the social event of the season, a playground for billionaires' tech moguls entitled Nobility. Fiona stared at the gold-leaf calligraphy, her brow furrowed in deep confusion. She had no connection to the Harringtons save for one brief professional encounter. 6 months prior, she had been contracted by an independent auditing firm to verify the authenticity of a series of 18th-century portraits the Harringtons were planning to auction. Fiona had done her job, submitted her report, which noted some irregular gaps in the ownership history of a particular Rembrandt sketch, and moved on. She assumed the invitation was an administrative error, a misprint by an overworked social secretary. She intended to throw it in the wastebasket, but her best friend and colleague Sarah had snatched it from her hands. "You are going?" Sarah had declared, her eyes wide with vicarious thrill. "Fiona, people literally kill for these invitations, the networking alone. Plus, you've been buried in that basement for 3 years since your mother passed. You need a night out. You need to wear a dress that isn't made of tweed." Against her better judgment, Fiona agreed. She rationalized that it might be a good opportunity to observe the very art pieces she had researched in their natural, albeit ostentatious habitat. The preparation, however, was a stark reminder of the chasm between her world and theirs. She couldn't afford the 5-figure designer gowns that women like Beatrice Blackwood or Lady Caroline Astor routinely flaunted. Instead, Fiona visited a high-end vintage boutique in Marylebone. After hours of searching, she found a dress, a deep emerald green silk gown from the late 1940s. It was unadorned, relying entirely on the masterful drape of the fabric and the rich and jewel-toned color to make an impact. With a few careful alterations she did herself on her grandmother's old sewing machine, the dress fit her like a glove. She paired it with her mother's simple pearl drop earrings and pulled her dark auburn hair into an elegant, understated chignon. When she looked in the mirror on the night of the gala, Fiona didn't see an aristocrat, but she saw a woman of quiet dignity. She felt a brief fluttering sense of confidence. That confidence, unfortunately, would not survive the first 10 minutes inside Harrington Manor. The rain was coming down in icy sheets as Fiona's modest rideshare pulled up to the sweeping lit driveway of the estate. Ahead of her, a parade of sleek black Maybachs, Rolls-Royces, and Bentleys discharged passengers dripping in diamonds and bespoke tuxedos. Fiona stepped out into the damp chill, instantly feeling the glaring spotlight of the paparazzi's flashbulbs. They snapped a few pictures out of pure reflex, But as soon as they realized she wasn't an actress or a recognizable heiress, the cameras lowered. One photographer actually groaned, waving her pass to make room for a recognizable tech billionaire. Fiona handed her damp trench coat to a white-gloved attendant at the door, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. She handed her invitation to the stern-faced maître d'. He scrutinized the cream card, then looked up at Fiona, his eyes flickering with a subtle, unmistakable condescension. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice flat. "Party of one." "Yes," Fiona replied, keeping her voice even. "Just me." "Very well. The ballroom is straight ahead." He didn't offer the slight bow he had given the couple before her. As Fiona crossed the threshold into the grand ballroom, she was hit by a wall of sensory extravagance. The ceiling was adorned with frescoes, illuminated by 3 colossal crystal chandeliers that cast a prismatic glow over the room. The air was thick with the scent of white lilies, expensive oud perfume, and the faint metallic tang of caviar. A string quartet played a lively Vivaldi piece in the corner. But as Fiona stepped further into the room, a chilling realization washed over her. She was the only person in the room who was alone. The Harrington Winter Gala, she suddenly realized, was an unwritten couples event. It was a space designed for power pairings, husbands and wives brokering deals, fiancé flaunting engagement rings the size of quail eggs. To arrive unaccompanied was not just an anomaly. In this particular echelon of society, it was viewed as a glaring symbol of social failure. She walked toward the champagne tower, hoping to blend into the shadows near the catering staff, but in her striking emerald dress blending in was impossible. The lion's den had spotted its prey. The whispers began almost immediately. They were not the loud, boisterous jeers of a schoolyard, but the refined, lethal murmurs of the upper class. Fiona felt the prickle of 100 eyes on her back. She picked up a crystal flute of champagne, her hand trembling just enough to send ripples through the golden liquid. Across the room stood Beatrice Blackwood. Beatrice was the undisputed queen of this particular social circle, a woman whose family wealth was eclipsed only by her renowned cruelty. She was draped in a silver-sequined Balenciaga gown, clinging to the arm of her husband, a notoriously corrupt hedge fund manager named Richard. Beatrice had eyes like a hawk, and she had zeroed in on Fiona the moment she walked through the doors. "Okay, good Lord," Beatrice whispered loudly to her circle of sycophants, which included the host's younger sister, Penelope Harrington, who left the servants' entrance unlocked. Did the catering staff get confused about the dress code? A chorus of malicious chiming laughter erupted from the group. Fiona, standing only a few yards away, heard every word. Her cheeks burned with a sudden fierce heat. She tried to focus on the intricate molding of the ceiling, trying to anchor herself in her architectural knowledge to block out the venom. "Wow, look at her," Penelope added, sipping her drink. "She's wearing vintage, and not the good kind of vintage. The I bought this at a charity shop kind of vintage. And she's alone. How tragic. Do you think she came hoping to trap a rich husband? Someone should tell her the billionaires here are already spoken for." Fiona's grip on her champagne glass tightened until her knuckles turned white. She had faced academic rivals, she had stared down stubborn museum curators, but this was a different kind of warfare. This was a psychological slaughterhouse, and she was entirely unarmed. Beatrice, never one to pass up an opportunity for direct confrontation, detached herself from her group and glided across the marble floor toward Fiona. She moved with the predatory grace of a shark smelling blood in the water. "Excuse me," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I don't believe we've been introduced. I am Beatrice Blackwood, and you are lost." Fiona turned to face her, forcing her spine to stiffen. "I'm Fiona Jenkins. I was invited by Lord Harrington." Beatrice's perfectly sculpted eyebrows shot up. She looked Fiona up and down, a slow, deliberate assessment that made Fiona feel utterly naked. "Jenkins? No, the name doesn't ring a bell. Are you one of Harrington's little charity cases, a scholarship girl? Perhaps it's so noble of him to invite the less fortunate to observe how the other half lives. I am an archivist. Fiona said, her voice remarkably steady despite the rapid pounding of her heart. I verified the provenance of the Rembrandt sketch that is being auctioned tonight. Ah, Beatrice said, her smile turning brittle and mean. A librarian. How quaint. Well, Miss Jenkins, a word of advice. Usually when one attends an event of this magnitude, one brings an escort. Arriving alone, well, it reeks of desperation. It makes people uncomfortable. You look like a stray dog begging for scraps beneath the dinner table. A few people standing nearby chuckled into their drinks. Fiona felt a hot sting of tears behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give this monster the satisfaction of seeing her break. I prefer my own company to the company of fools, Fiona said quietly. Beatrice's eyes flashed with genuine anger. The fake sweetness vanished, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. Listen to me, you little nobody. You do not belong here. You are a stain on this room. Your dress is cheap. Your lineage is non-existent, and your presence is an insult to the people who actually matter. If you have a shred of dignity left in that thrift store rag you're wearing, you'll put your coat back on and walk out the front door before I have security throw you out for loitering. The music seemed to dip. The conversation in the immediate vicinity ceased entirely. Everyone was watching. The humiliation was absolute, suffocating, and total. Fiona looked around at the faces of the elite, the CEOs, the lords, the socialites. Not a single person offered a sympathetic glance. They were enjoying the show. To them, she was not a human being, she was entertainment. The weight of their collective judgment crushed the last bit of resolve out of her. Fiona swallowed hard, the lump in her throat feeling like a jagged stone. Beatrice was right. She didn't belong here. She had been foolish to think she could step into this world and survive. You're right, Fiona whispered, her voice cracking. I'll leave. Beatrice smirked a triumphant, ugly expression. Good girl. Don't trip on your way to the gutter. Fiona turned around, placing her untouched champagne on a passing waiter's tray. She kept her eyes glued to the marble floor, navigating her way toward the grand foyer, desperate to escape the oppressive heat of the room and the burning shame in her chest. She just needed to get her coat. She just needed to get into the rain and disappear back into her quiet, invisible life. But she would never make it to the coat check. As Fiona's hand reached out to push past the heavy oak doors leading to the foyer, a sudden jarring commotion erupted from the front entrance. The stern maitre d' who had treated Fiona with such dismissive apathy was suddenly shouting frantically into a two-way radio. Security guards in dark suits sprinted past Fiona, forming a rigid protective corridor leading from the front doors straight into the heart of the ballroom. The Vivaldi piece came to a screeching halt. The low hum of aristocratic chatter was instantly silenced, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Even Beatrice Blackwood stopped mid-laugh, her wine glass hovering inches from her lips. Through the massive open doors walked Michael Pendleton, the Duke of Westmoreland. To call Michael Pendleton wealthy would be a gross understatement. His family essentially owned the ground upon which half of Mayfair was built. At 38, he was a figure of absolute power and intense mystery. He possessed a sharp, aristocratic profile, dark, piercing eyes that seemed to analyze and dismiss people in a fraction of a second, and a presence that demanded immediate, unquestioning deference. He was notoriously reclusive. He had not attended a public social event in nearly 5 years following a vicious, highly publicized corporate takeover that had cemented his reputation as a ruthless, unsentimental titan of industry. He was flanked by 2 imposing security men, but he moved with the casual, predatory stride of a man who owned the world and found it incredibly boring. He was dressed impeccably in a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that made the other men in the room look as though they were wearing rented suits. Lord Harrington, the host of the gala, nearly tripped over his own feet as he scrambled forward to greet the Duke. Your Grace. Harrington stammered, his face flushed with panicked excitement. We are profoundly honored. We had no idea you were coming. Please let me show you to the VIP. Michael didn't even look at him. He didn't break his stride. He walked straight past Lord Harrington as if the man were a piece of furniture. The crowd parted for him instinctively, stepping back in awe and fear. Beatrice Blackwood practically shoved her husband aside, adjusting her posture, her eyes gleaming with sudden desperate ambition. If she could secure even 2 minutes of conversation with the Duke of Westmoreland, her social standing would be untouchable for a decade. She pasted on her most seductive, welcoming smile and took a step forward as Michael approached her section of the room. Your Grace. Beatrice purred, preparing to extend her hand. Michael's gaze slid past Beatrice, completely ignoring her existence. His dark eyes swept the room, searching, and then he stopped. His eyes locked onto Fiona. Fiona had frozen near the exit, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched in stunned disbelief as the most powerful man in England changed his trajectory and walked directly toward her. The entire ballroom held its breath. The silence was absolute. One could have heard a silk ribbon drop to the floor. Michael stopped inches from Fiona. The cold, unapproachable mask he wore for the public instantly melted away. The ruthless Duke of Westmoreland looked down at the woman in the modest green dress, and his eyes softened with a profound, unmistakable tenderness. Fiona. His voice was a deep, resonant baritone that carried easily through the dead, silent room. He reached out, taking her trembling hand in his. He didn't shake it. He bowed his head slightly and pressed a gentle, lingering kiss to her knuckles. I am so entirely sorry I am late. Michael said, his tone incredibly gentle, entirely oblivious to the hundreds of gaping mouths around them. The flight from Zurich was grounded due to the storm, and my driver got caught in the absolute worst of the Mayfair traffic. I was terrified you had grown bored and left. Fiona stared at him, her mind blanking. Michael, what are you doing here? She whispered. I promised you I would come. He replied, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. He then looked up, his demeanor shifting instantly as his eyes scanned the crowd surrounding them. His gaze hardened into something dangerous, something lethal, as it settled on Beatrice Blackwood, who was staring at them with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Michael had recognized the tears shining in Fiona's eyes. He had seen her walking toward the exit. He knew exactly what kind of vipers occupied this room. However, Michael's voice cut through the air like a cracking whip. It appears my delay has left you exposed to the lesser elements of society. He placed a protective hand on the small of Fiona's back, pulling her flush against his side. It was a clear territorial claim that sent shockwaves through the watching crowd. Lord Harrington, sweating profusely, finally managed to scurry over to them. Your Grace, we did not realize you were acquainted with Miss Jenkins. Miss Jenkins. Michael repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. He turned his terrifying gaze onto the host. Is that how you addressed her? Harrington. Well, yes, her invitation. Her invitation. Michael interrupted, his voice echoing in the vast space, was addressed to Fiona Pendleton, the Duchess of Westmoreland. A collective gasp echoed through the ballroom. Beatrice Blackwood actually stumbled backward, her hand flying to her throat as if she were suffocating. The glass in Penelope Harrington's hand slipped from her grasp, shattering violently against the marble floor, but nobody looked down. We have been privately married for over a year. Michael continued, his eyes locked onto Beatrice, who was visibly shaking. My wife is a woman of immense intellect and passion, and she requested privacy to complete her archival work at Oxford without the nuisance of the press, or the parasitic attention of social climbers. Michael took a step forward, keeping Fiona safely tucked against his side. He leaned in slightly toward Beatrice. couldn't help but overhear the tail end of your conversation as I walked in Mrs. Blackwood. Something about my wife not belonging here. Something about her lineage. Beatrice opened her mouth, but only a dry, pathetic squeak came out. Her face was entirely drained of color. "Let me be incredibly clear," Michael said, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "My wife does not just belong in this room. My wife owns this room." Lord Harrington let out a strangled noise. I beg your pardon?" "Your Grace." Michael reached inside the breast pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a thick-folded legal document. He tossed it casually onto a silver catering tray nearby. "You invited my wife here tonight, Harrington, to show off the art collection she helped authenticate," Michael stated, his eyes gleaming with a ruthless satisfaction. "What you did not know is that during her research, my brilliant Duchess uncovered the true provenance of the Harrington estate. The deeds, the wealth, and the land were illegally seized from the Jenkins family in 1842 through a forged bankruptcy decree. The silence in the room was deafening. Lord Harrington looked as though he were about to suffer a massive cardiac event. "I've spent the last 6 months quietly employing the best legal minds in Europe to correct this historical injustice," Michael said, turning back to look at Fiona with immense pride. "The paperwork cleared the high courts this afternoon in Zurich. This estate, this art, the very floor you are all standing on it, legally belongs to Fiona. So, Mrs. Blackwood, when you tell my wife she is a stray dog begging for scraps, you are speaking to the landlord of the house you are currently standing in." Michael smiled, a chilling, looping expression that made the surrounding elite physically recoil. "Now," the Duke of Westmoreland commanded, his voice echoing with absolute finality, "every single person who laughed at my wife, get out of her house." The silence that followed the Duke of Westmoreland's decree was not merely quiet. It was a physical weight pressing down on the collective lungs of London's most arrogant elite. For 3 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the relentless drumming of the winter rain against the towering Palladian windows of the ballroom. Reginald Harrington. The suddenly former lord of the manor broke the silence with a wet, sputtering gasp. He lunged toward the silver catering tray, his manicured hands trembling violently as he snatched up the thick stack of legal documents Michael had casually discarded. This is an absolute absurdity." Reginald shrieked, his voice cracking by an octave, stripping away decades of carefully cultivated aristocratic poise. "A forgery. A stunt. You cannot simply walk into my home and declare it belongs to a librarian." Michael Pendleton did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You will find the seal of the Chancery Division of the High Court on page 4, Reginald. Furthermore, the injunction was filed by Slaughter and May, signed off by the lead magistrate not 3 hours ago. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises before the Metropolitan Police arrive to enforce the eviction. Though considering the scale of the historical fraud your great-great-grandfather committed, I would suggest using that time to hire a formidable criminal defense attorney rather than packing your silverware." Reginald's eyes darted frantically over the heavy vellum pages. The color drained from his face so rapidly that Fiona genuinely feared the man might collapse. The arrogant patriarch of the Harrington family slumped against a marble pillar, the documents slipping from his numb fingers to scatter across the polished floor. The realization hit the crowd like a shockwave. The Duke wasn't bluffing. The social hierarchy of Mayfair had just been decapitated in front of their eyes. Panic masked thinly by the desire to avoid being associated with a disgraced, suddenly impoverished family rippled through the ballroom. The billionaire's tech moguls entitled nobility, who had been sneering at Fiona mere minutes ago, were suddenly desperate to escape her presence. Beatrice Blackwood, the vicious architect of Fiona's humiliation, was the first to attempt a retreat. She grabbed her husband Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his tuxedo jacket. She kept her eyes glued to the floor, hoping to slip away unnoticed into the throng of fleeing guests. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Blackwood?" Michael's voice sliced through the rising murmur of the crowd, freezing Beatrice in her tracks. She turned slowly, her face a mask of poorly concealed terror. The predatory shark had become the prey. We have an early flight to Gstaad, Your Grace." She stammered, her voice devoid of its former venomous purr. Michael's gaze was glacial. "I suggest you take a long, hard look at your own financial portfolios, Richard," Michael said, shifting his attention to Beatrice's husband, the corrupt hedge fund manager. "My forensic accountants at Kroll stumbled upon some fascinating offshore routing while mapping the Harrington assets. It seems the Blackwood accounts share the same shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. A dossier has already been forwarded to the Serious Fraud Office. Have a safe flight." Richard Blackwood visibly swayed his face, turning an ashen gray. Beatrice let out a muffled sob, dropping her husband's arm as if he were suddenly radioactive. Without another word, she turned and fled toward the coat check, abandoning all pretense of dignity, pushing past a startled tech billionaire in her desperation to reach the front door. That was the breaking point. The orderly, elegant gala devolved into a chaotic stampede of silk and diamonds. The very people who had demanded Fiona's exclusion were now desperately fleeing her newly acquired home. They practically fought each other to reach the grand foyer, shouting at the bewildered coat attendants and demanding their vehicles be brought around immediately. Fiona stood frozen against Michael's side, her mind struggling to process the sheer velocity of the paradigm shift. She watched the mass exodus of the people who had tried to break her. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt entirely numb. Within 15 minutes, the grand ballroom, which had been pulsating with hundreds of the world's most powerful people, was entirely empty. The string quartet had packed their instruments and vanished. The catering staff hovered nervously in the shadowed hallways, unsure of who they were currently employed by. Only 3 people remained in the cavernous space: Michael, Fiona, and Reginald Harrington, who was still sitting on the floor amidst the scattered legal papers, weeping silently into his hands. Michael gestured smoothly to his 2 imposing security guards, who stepped out of the shadows. "Escort Mr. Harrington to his private quarters," Michael instructed coldly. "Ensure he does not remove any historical assets, artwork, or jewelry. He may take his clothing and personal effects." You monster?" Reginald spat, looking up with tear-streaked, venomous eyes. "You planned this. You destroyed my family for her." "Your family destroyed itself the moment it stole from hers," Michael replied evenly. "Take him upstairs." As the guards hauled the ruined aristocrat away, the heavy mahogany doors closed, leaving Michael and Fiona completely alone in the echoing, brilliantly lit ballroom. Michael turned to her, the ruthless, terrifying persona melting away in an instant. He let out a long, shuddering breath and pulled Fiona into a fierce, desperate embrace. He buried his face in her dark auburn hair, holding her as if he feared she might vanish into thin air. "I am so sorry," he whispered against her ear, his voice tight with raw emotion. "I am so incredibly sorry I was late. I saw the way they were looking at you. I heard what that vile woman said. If I had been 10 minutes earlier—" Fiona pulled back slightly, looking up into the dark, familiar eyes of the man she loved. Her hands rested on the lapels of his tuxedo. "Michael, what have you done?" She breathed, her voice trembling. "A house. You bought a house and a title. What is happening?" Michael offered a small, bittersweet smile, reaching up to gently tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "I didn't buy a house, Fiona. I took back what was already yours. And as for the title, well, I suppose it's time I explained exactly what I've been doing on my business trips to Geneva." Michael led Fiona out of the grand ballroom and down a long, oak-paneled corridor toward the estate's private library. It was a room Fiona had previously only seen in photographs during her Provenance research, a stunning circular sanctuary lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany shelves smelling of old leather and expensive scotch. He guided her to a plush Chesterfield sofa by the unlit fireplace. then moved to a crystal decanter on a side table, pouring 2 generous measures of Macallan 25. He handed her a glass, his eyes scanning her face with deep concern. "Drink," he urged gently. "You're still shivering." Fiona took a sip, the amber liquid burning a fiery grounding path down her throat. She set the glass down and looked at her husband. They had met 2 years ago in the quiet archives of the Bodleian. He had come in under an assumed name, researching his own complex family tree, and Fiona had been the one assigned to help him. They had fallen in love over dusty ledgers and shared sandwiches in the rain. When he finally revealed his true identity, Fiona had been terrified of the public scrutiny. She had agreed to marry him only on the condition of absolute secrecy until she finished her master's thesis and secured her tenure. "Michael," Fiona said, her voice steadying, "I need you to tell me everything, now. You told me you were fighting a corporate merger in Switzerland. You didn't tell me you were dismantling a peer of the realm." Michael sat beside her, taking her hands in his. "I couldn't tell you, Fiona, for 2 reasons. First, the legal battle required absolute discretion. If Harrington had caught wind of the investigation, he would have started liquidating assets and funneling the money offshore. I needed him to believe he was untouchable." "And the second reason?" she asked. Michael sighed, his gaze dropping to her hands. "Plausible deniability. If the injunction failed, if Harrington's lawyers managed to tie us up in the high court for a decade, I didn't want you dragged into a vicious public legal war. I wanted to hand you a victory, not a battlefield." Fiona shook her head, still struggling to comprehend the scale of the revelation. "But how I did the provenance report on the Rembrandt sketch. I found gaps in the ownership in the 1840s, yes, but nothing that suggested a massive estate-wide fraud." "Because you were looking at the art, my love," Michael said softly. "You weren't looking at the frame." Fiona frowned, her archivist's mind suddenly clicking into gear. "The frame," Michael nodded. "Do you remember when you brought your initial findings home? You mentioned casually that the backing board of the Rembrandt sketch was unusually thick for the period, constructed from a dense foreign cedar rather than local oak. You thought it was an odd preservation choice." "I remember," Fiona said slowly. "I couldn't get it out of my head," Michael confessed. "The Harrington fortune exploded in 1843, seemingly overnight. And your family, the Jenkins family, who were prominent maritime merchants, went completely bankrupt in 1842. Your great-great-grandfather, Silas Jenkins, died penniless in a debtor's prison." Fiona felt a chill trace down her spine. She had always known her family had once been prosperous before a catastrophic business failure in the 19th century, but the details had been lost to time and shame. "I hired a team of private historical investigators in London." Michael continued, "I paid a substantial bribe to a rather unethical restorer to get me 10 minutes alone with that Rembrandt sketch while it was in transit to the auction house. I dismantled the frame." Fiona gasped. "Michael, you could have ruined a masterpiece." "I didn't touch the canvas," he assured her, a wicked glint in his eye. But behind the cedar backing board, wedged into a false cavity, was a ledger. Silas Jenkins's private ledger. Michael stood up and walked over to the massive mahogany desk in the center of the library. He unlocked a heavy leather briefcase he had brought with him and pulled out a fragile, leather-bound book wrapped in archival tissue. He brought it to Fiona, placing it gently on her lap. Fiona's hands trembled as she touched the brittle cover. She opened it carefully. The pages were filled with faded, cramped script. The ledger proves that Silas Jenkins never went bankrupt. Michael explained, his voice low and intense. He had partnered with Lord Alistair Harrington Reginald's ancestor to finance a massive shipping fleet. When the fleet struck gold in the West Indies, Harrington didn't want to split the profits. He forged Silas's signature on a series of predatory loans, bribed a judge in the chancery, and had Silas thrown in prison for debts he didn't owe. Harrington seized Silas's assets, including the land this very house is built upon, to cover the fictitious debt. Fiona stared at the ledger, tears blurring her vision. The ink on the pages was not just history, it was the stolen life of her ancestor. It was a generational trauma, a theft of opportunity that had trickled down through the decades, resulting in her mother struggling to pay heating bills in a damp flat while the Harringtons drank vintage champagne under frescoed ceilings. Silas hid the true ledger behind the sketch of his favorite painting, hoping someone would eventually find it. Michael said gently, "The law firm Slaughter and May took the ledger to the High Court. We matched the forged signatures on the 1842 bankruptcy decree with Alistair Harrington's known handwriting." The judge was appalled. The ruling wasn't just a transfer of property, Fiona. It was a complete invalidation of the Harrington estate. By right of blood and law, everything they own belongs to the Jenkins Trust, belongs to you. Fiona closed the ledger, tracing the embossed J on the cover. The overwhelming sense of imposter syndrome that had plagued her all night vanished, replaced by a profound, righteous clarity. She hadn't crashed a billionaire's party. She had come to collect a debt that was a century and a half overdue. "They laughed at me," Fiona whispered, looking up at Michael. "They looked at my dress, and they laughed because they thought I was nothing." Michael knelt in front of her, taking her face in his hands. His dark eyes were fierce, blazing, with a protective devotion that took her breath away. "You are the Duchess of Westmoreland. You are the rightful heir to the largest restored fortune in modern British history. You are the woman who outsmarted them all simply by doing your job." He leaned in, kissing her deeply, a promise of unyielding support. "So," Michael murmured against her lips, "what exactly would you like to do with your new house?" "Your Grace." Fiona looked past him, her eyes sweeping over the opulent library, the stolen wealth that had finally come home. A slow, dangerous smile curved her lips. "First," Fiona said, her voice steady and echoing with newfound authority, "we are going to change the locks." The morning sun broke through the heavy London clouds, casting long, pale rays across the manicured lawns of what was no longer Harrington Manor. Inside the grand foyer, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of the previous night's intoxicating glamour. The scent of spilled champagne and expensive perfume had been replaced by the sterile, bureaucratic smell of fresh ink and cardboard boxes. Fiona stood at the base of the sweeping marble staircase, wearing a simple tailored navy suit. Beside her stood Inspector Thomas Sterling of the Metropolitan Police's Fraud Division, accompanied by Geoffrey Hughes, a senior partner at Slaughter and May. "We have secured the perimeter, Your Grace," Inspector Sterling said, addressing Fiona with a respectful nod that still made her blink in surprise. "Mr. Harrington and his sister have been confined to the East Wing guest quarters while they pack their personal effects. All bank accounts linked to the estate have been frozen pending the final audit." Fiona nodded, her eyes tracing the intricate gold leaf on the ceiling. It was overwhelming. The sheer scale of the theft her family had endured was woven into every inch of this opulence. A sudden sharp crash from the upper landing shattered the morning quiet. Penelope Harrington, the woman who had loudly declared Fiona a stray dog, came marching down the stairs. Her face was flushed with indignant rage, a stark contrast to the pale panic she had exhibited the night before. She was clutching a large velvet-lined jewelry box to her chest, followed closely by a weary-looking private security guard. "Oh, this is outrageous!" Penelope shrieked, her voice echoing harshly. "You cannot possibly lay claim to my mother's diamonds. This is personal property. You usurping little... Miss Harrington, please step down," Inspector Sterling warned, placing a hand on his radio. Fiona held up a hand, stopping the inspector. She walked calmly up the first 3 steps to meet Penelope eye to eye. The psychological terror Fiona had felt the previous night was entirely gone, replaced by the cool, analytical detachment she used when cataloging historical artifacts. "Open the box, Penelope." Fiona requested, her voice dangerously quiet. "I will do no such thing." Penelope sneered, though her grip on the velvet box trembled. These are heirlooms. Geoffrey Hughes, the solicitor, stepped forward, consulting a thick leather-bound binder. According to the archival records retrieved from the Jenkins ledger, Miss Harrington, the Jenkins Family Trust purchased a parure of flawless South African diamonds in 1840, featuring a distinct teardrop-cut central stone weighing 42 carats. Is that the piece currently residing in your box? Maswans. Penelope's jaw snapped shut. She looked desperately toward the top of the stairs, as if hoping her brother would appear and save her from this nightmare. Open it. Fiona commanded, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. Defeated, Penelope popped the brass clasp. Inside, resting on white satin, was a dazzling teardrop diamond necklace that caught the morning light and threw prisms across the walls. Fiona recognized it instantly from her research. It was the famous Tears of Mayfair piece, long rumored to be the crown jewel of the Harrington collection. Beautiful, Fiona murmured. She reached out gently, lifting the heavy necklace from the box. And purchased with blood money stolen from a man rotting in a debtor's prison. Inspector Sterling, please log this into the Asset Recovery Manifest. Penelope, you may take your clothing, your modern electronics, and whatever cash you have in your wallet. If you attempt to smuggle one more historical artifact out of this house, I will press criminal theft charges. Penelope let out a strangled, humiliated sob, dropping the empty box and fleeing back up the stairs. As the morning progressed, the true scale of the social earthquake became apparent. By 9 a.m., the story had broken. Someone, likely one of the fleeing guests or a well-paid member of the catering staff, had tipped off the press. The headlines of every major UK newspaper and global tabloid were absolute firestorms. The fall of the House of Harrington. Billionaire Duke's secret wife seizes Mayfair estate. From archivist to aristocrat, the century-old fraud exposed. Michael emerged from the library, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, and passed his tablet to Fiona. It appears your phone is about to become very popular, my love, he said with a wry smile. He was right. Fiona's previously quiet cell phone began vibrating relentlessly. The screen lit up with numbers she didn't recognize, followed by frantic groveling voicemails from the very people who had stood by and laughed at her humiliation. Lady Carolyn Astor left a tearful 3-minute message claiming she had tried to stop Beatrice's cruel words. A prominent tech CEO offered Fiona a position on his philanthropic board. They were terrified. The Harrington family had been the untouchable bedrock of their social circle. If the Harringtons could be utterly annihilated overnight by a quiet archivist and a ruthless duke, no one felt safe. But the most pressing matter was not the sycophants. It was the auction. The Harringtons had scheduled a massive, highly publicized art auction for the following weekend to liquidate a portion of their assets. The catalogs had been printed, the international buyers were flying in, and the venue, the grand ballroom of the estate itself, was already prepped. Cancel it, Geoffrey Hughes advised, pushing his glasses up his nose. The assets are now tangled in the Jenkins Trust. It's too complex to proceed safely. Fiona looked at the auction catalog sitting on the foyer table, its glossy cover boasting the stolen Rembrandt sketch. She thought about Beatrice Blackwood, Reginald Harrington, and the entire ecosystem of cruel, entitled vultures who fed off the labor and ruin of others. No. Fiona said softly, a brilliant, terrifying idea taking root in her mind. Do not cancel it. We are going to hold the auction exactly as planned, but we are changing the guest list. Michael raised an eyebrow, a slow smirk spreading across his handsome face. And who exactly are we inviting, Duchess? Everyone who was here last night, Fiona replied, her eyes flashing with cold determination. And we are going to make sure they have no choice but to attend. 2 weeks later, the grand ballroom of the newly rechristened Jenkins estate was once again filled with the suffocating scent of expensive perfumes and the nervous murmur of the elite. However, the atmosphere was vastly different from the gala. There was no lively string quartet, no overflowing champagne towers, and absolutely no laughter. The attendees sat in rows of gilded chairs looking less like honored guests and more like hostages facing a tribunal. They had all received a secondary, brutally formal summons to the auction. Michael Pendleton had utilized his vast corporate leverage, quietly freezing pending mergers, threatening board seats, and hinting at hostile takeovers to ensure that every single person who had witnessed Fiona's humiliation returned to the scene of the crime. In the front row sat Beatrice Blackwood. She looked a decade older. The Serious Fraud Office had indeed raided her husband's hedge fund the previous week, and Richard was currently out on bail, his assets frozen. Beatrice wore a subdued black dress, her eyes darting nervously toward the podium at the front of the room. At precisely 8 p.m., the heavy mahogany doors closed with a resounding thud. The lights dimmed, illuminating only the stage. Fiona stepped up to the podium. She did not wear a vintage thrift store gown tonight. She wore a bespoke blood-red Alexander McQueen suit that radiated absolute authority. Around her neck rested the Tears of Mayfair diamond necklace, a glittering, undeniable symbol of her reclaimed power. Michael stood in the shadows near the wings, watching his wife with undisguised awe. The room fell deathly silent. "Good evening," Fiona said, her voice amplified clearly by the microphone. She did not stumble. She did not shake. "Welcome to the Jenkins estate. Tonight was supposed to be an auction to enrich a family built on theft. Instead, it will be a night of historical correction." She gestured to the large screen behind her. Instead of displaying the Rembrandt sketch, the screen flashed to life, displaying a highly complex digitized spiderweb of bank routing numbers, shell corporations, and offshore trust accounts. A collective gasp echoed through the room. Several billionaires in the audience shifted violently in their seats. Beatrice Blackwood covered her mouth with a trembling hand. During the audit of the Harrington assets, Fiona continued her tone conversational but razor-sharp. "My husband's forensic accounting team discovered something fascinating hidden beneath the wine cellar, a physical vault. Reginald Harrington, it seems, did not just hoard stolen art. He hoarded secrets. He kept a meticulous, deeply illegal blackmail ledger on almost every single family in this room." The silence in the ballroom was so absolute it felt as though the oxygen had been sucked from the air. Tax evasion, insider trading, bribery of public officials. Fiona listed, tapping the podium rhythmically. The Harringtons used this leverage to maintain their position at the top of the social food chain. They knew all of your dirty secrets, and they kept you in line. When you laughed at me 2 weeks ago, you weren't just being cruel, you were performing for your blackmailers. A prominent tech mogul in the third row stood up, his face red with panic. "This is extortion. You cannot legally possess those documents." "I don't possess them," Fiona corrected him smoothly. "The original documents were handed over to Inspector Sterling of the Metropolitan Police this morning." Pandemonium threatened to break out. People began whispering frantically, some reaching for their phones. However. Fiona's voice boomed over the speakers, cutting through the panic. "The police are notoriously slow. The investigations will take months, perhaps years. Which brings us to the purpose of tonight's auction." She clicked a button on the podium. The screen behind her changed from the financial web to a list of massive global charitable organizations, refugee housing funds, historical reparation trusts, public library endowments, and severe poverty relief programs. "You see, the artwork the Harringtons possess legally belongs to me now," Fiona explained. "I have no desire to keep it. Tonight I'm auctioning off the entire collection. The catch is this: I've already set the reserve prices for every piece, and those prices are extraordinarily high." Fiona locked eyes with Beatrice Blackwood. "If the total amount raised tonight does not reach £200 million, Fiona said coldly, "my husband's legal team will expedite the delivery of the digital backups of the Harrington blackmail vault directly to the desks of the investigative journalists at The Guardian and The Times tomorrow morning. The trap was sprung. It was a masterpiece of coercion. She wasn't blackmailing them for personal gain. She was forcing them to financially bleed themselves dry for the very charities they despised, using their own corruption as the weapon. Think of it as a mandatory philanthropy tax. Michael's deep voice echoed as he stepped out of the shadows, joining Fiona at the podium. He surveyed the trapped elite with absolute disdain. You will buy this stolen art. You will pay 10 times its market value. The money will go to the people your families have exploited for centuries, and in exchange your reputations survive the weak. Fiona picked up the wooden auctioneer's gavel resting on the podium. She looked out at the sea of pale, terrified faces. They had stripped her of her dignity, and now she was systematically stripping them of their wealth and power. Lot number 1, Fiona announced, signaling for 2 guards to wheel out the Rembrandt sketch that had started it all. The starting bid is £5 million. Mrs. Blackwood, I believe I saw your paddle twitch. Beatrice, her hand shaking violently slowly, raised her numbered paddle into the air. Excellent. Fiona smiled a brilliant, unforgiving expression. Let the bidding begin. The silence that followed Fiona's opening bid was absolute and heavy with resentment. No one moved. The billionaires, tech magnates, and aristocrats who filled the gilded chairs of the Jenkins Estate ballroom simply stared at her, their expressions a volatile mix of fury and disbelief. They were accustomed to being the predators, the ones who dictated terms. To be trapped in a room extorted for philanthropy by a woman they had collectively deemed a stray dog just 14 days prior was a psychological shock they could barely process. £5 million. Fiona repeated her voice, echoing off the frescoed ceiling. She leaned forward, resting her hands on the wooden edges of the podium. Perhaps you didn't hear me, or perhaps you need a reminder of what is at stake. Inspector Sterling is currently cataloging the physical evidence. I, however, have the digital decryption keys to the Harrington vault. $5 million for the Rembrandt sketch. Going once. In the third row, Harrison Cole, a notoriously ruthless Silicon Valley transplant and CEO of a global data mining firm, shot to his feet. This is a farce. We will not be held hostage by a librarian. If we all refuse to bid, you have nothing. You wouldn't dare leak those files because you'd be implicating half the British economy. Michael Pendleton stepped out from the shadows of the stage, his presence immediately dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. He didn't raise his voice, but the lethal calm in his tone commanded absolute obedience. Try me, Mr. Cole. The Duke of Westmoreland said, his dark eyes locking onto the tech billionaire. My wealth is insulated. My wife's newfound wealth is bulletproof. The British economy will survive your personal downfall. I have a direct line to the editor-in-chief of The Times. I can have your offshore tax evasion records on the front page before the morning edition goes to print. Your board of directors will oust you by noon. Michael checked his platinum Patek Philippe watch. You have exactly 10 seconds to sit down and raise your paddle, or you will be the first casualty of the evening. Harrison Cole's face drained of color. He looked around the room, hoping for a rebellion, but his peers averted their eyes. The solidarity of the elite was entirely transactional. No one was willing to fall on their sword for him. Shaking with rage and humiliation, Cole slowly sank back into his gilded chair. He raised his paddle. $5 million bid by Mr. Cole. Fiona announced smoothly, a sharp, triumphant smile playing on her lips. Do I hear 10? 10, croaked Lady Caroline Astor, terrified that her family's historical bribery of maritime shipping routes would be exposed. 15, muttered a shipping magnate from the back row. The dam broke. Driven by sheer, unadulterated terror of public ruin and criminal prosecution, the wealthiest people in London began to bid against each other with frantic desperation. It was a bloodletting of unprecedented proportions. Fiona stood at the podium, an avenging angel in Alexander McQueen, ruthlessly driving the prices higher. She was a master of the archives. She knew exactly what these pieces were worth in the real world, and she forced the crowd to pay 10, sometimes 20 times that amount. A 19th century Fabergé egg, originally stolen from a Russian diplomat by Lord Harrington's grandfather, was purchased for £32 million by a venture capitalist desperate to hide his illicit affairs from the press. A set of Renaissance tapestries went to Lady Caroline Astor for $40 million, prompting her to frantically text her wealth manager at Coutts to liquidate a block of highly profitable pharmaceutical stocks. Beatrice Blackwood, who had initiated Fiona's humiliation on the night of the gala, was sweating profusely. Her husband's hedge fund was already under investigation by the Serious Fraud Office, and the Blackwoods desperately needed to keep the Harrington blackmail files regarding their Cayman Island shell companies hidden. Fiona signaled for the final item of the night to be brought out. 2 security guards wheeled a glass display case onto the stage. Inside, resting on black velvet, was a diamond-encrusted tiara that had once belonged to French royalty, the final lot. Fiona announced, staring directly at Beatrice. The total raised for the Global Refugee and Public Library endowments currently stands at $160 million. We are $40 million short of the reserve required to keep your secrets buried. The starting bid for the tiara is £40 million. The room groaned. People were already financially bleeding, having emptied liquid asset accounts and authorized emergency transfers via UBS and Credit Suisse. Beatrice stared at the tiara, her hands trembling so violently she dropped her paddle. Richard, her disgraced husband, picked it up and shoved it into her hand. "Bid!" He hissed, his face pale with panic. "If the SFO gets the Harrington files on the Caymans, I'm looking at 20 years in Belmarsh. Bid Beatrice." Beatrice raised the paddle, tears of absolute defeat streaming down her perfectly contoured face. "$40 million, she whispered, her voice cracking. "Speak up, Mrs. Blackwood," Fiona said, her tone devoid of pity. "I cannot hear you." $40 million! Beatrice cried out, a sob tearing from her throat. It was the entirety of her personal trust fund. The wealth she had used as a weapon to bludgeon others was gone in a single devastating sentence. "Sold," Fiona said. She brought the wooden auctioneer's gavel down with a sharp, resounding crack that echoed like a gunshot. "To Beatrice Blackwood." Fiona looked up at the digital totalizer projected on the screen behind her. It read £203,500,000. A collective shuddering sigh of relief washed over the ballroom. The billionaires slumped in their chairs, wiping sweat from their brows, exhausted and financially gutted. They had paid their ransom. Their secrets were safe. "The auction is concluded," Fiona said, her voice ringing with absolute finality. "Jeffrey Hughes, my solicitor from Slaughter and May, is standing by the exit with the digital transfer authorization forms. Nobody leaves this room until the funds have cleared into the respective charitable trusts." Harrison Cole stood up, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket, trying to salvage a shred of his dignity. "We paid your extortion, Duchess. You have your $200 million. Now delete the files." Fiona looked at him, her eyes cold and calculating. "Oh, Mr. Cole, I believe you misunderstood me." The room went dead silent again. The relief vanished, replaced by a sudden sickening dread. "I said that if the total did not reach $200 million, I would send the files to the press tomorrow morning." Fiona clarified, her voice dangerously quiet. "I never said I would delete them if you met the goal." Beatrice Blackwood let out a strangled gasp. You promised—" "I promised you a chance to fund the charities your families have starved for centuries," Fiona replied. "But I am an archivist, Mrs. Blackwood. I preserve history. I do not destroy it. And I am certainly not in the business of harboring criminals." Michael stepped up beside his wife, his dark eyes gleaming with ruthless satisfaction. He pulled his phone from his pocket and pressed a single button. The digital backups of the Harrington blackmail vault. Michael announced, his voice booming over the speakers, were just transmitted to the lead investigators at the Serious Fraud Office, the Metropolitan Police, and the Financial Crimes Division of Scotland Yard. Absolute chaos erupted. Billionaires screamed. Lady Caroline Astor fainted, collapsing onto the marble floor in a heap of silk. Harrison Cole hurled his paddle across the room and sprinted for the doors, only to find them blocked by Michael's private security team, waiting to escort them to the authorization tables. They had been utterly outmaneuvered. They had been forced to empty their bank accounts for charity, and they were going to prison anyway. Fiona watched the pandemonium with cool, detached satisfaction. She had not just leveled the playing field, she had scorched the earth and salted the ground where their empires once stood. "Good night, Mayfair," Fiona whispered into the microphone. It took nearly 3 hours to process the frantic forced wealth transfers and escort the disgraced weeping elite out of the Jenkins estate. By midnight, the grand ballroom was finally empty save for Fiona Michael and the scattered discarded auction paddles on the floor. The silence that settled over the estate now was different. It was no longer the oppressive, exclusionary silence of high society. It was the peaceful, quiet hum of a house that had finally been cleansed. Fiona stood by the Palladian windows, looking out over the dark, rain-swept lawns. The heavy burden of adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a profound, aching exhaustion. But beneath the fatigue was a radiant core of peace. She had done it. She had avenged her great-great-grandfather. She had avenged her mother's lifelong struggle, and she had dismantled the corrupt system that had laughed at her. Michael walked up behind her, wrapping his strong arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He kissed the side of her neck gently. £203 million to global charities, Michael murmured, looking out the window with her. And dozens of arrest warrants being typed up at Scotland Yard as we speak. You were magnificent tonight, Fiona. Absolutely terrifying, but magnificent. Fiona leaned back into his embrace, closing her eyes. I never wanted to be terrifying, Michael. I just wanted to read my books in the archives. I know, he said softly. But sometimes to protect the library, you have to burn down the wolves. She turned in his arms, looking up into the face of the man who had loved her when she was a nobody in a vintage dress, the man who had weaponized his immense power to hand her the sword she needed. So, Michael asked, brushing a strand of dark auburn hair from her cheek. What happens now, Duchess? Do we move in? Shall I hire a staff of 50 and start throwing galas of our own? Fiona looked around the opulent frescoed ballroom. It was beautiful, undeniably so, but it was not her home. It was a monument to ego and theft. No, Fiona said firmly. I don't want to live here. It's too big, it's too cold, and it has too many ghosts. Michael smiled, clearly relieved. Thank God. I loathe Mayfair traffic. Where do we go then? We go home to our townhouse in Oxford, Fiona said. I have a master's thesis to finish on 18th century maritime trade routes, but this building... She looked up at the crystal chandeliers. I've been speaking with Geoffrey Hughes. I am placing the estate, the remaining art, and the land into an irrevocable public trust. Michael's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. You're giving it away. I'm giving it back, Fiona corrected him gently. It will be renamed the Silas Jenkins Historical Museum and Library. Free admission to the public. Fully funded research grants for working-class historians and archivists. The East Wing will be converted into affordable housing for university scholars. Reginald Harrington's precious private library will be open to anyone who wants to read. Michael stared at her, his eyes filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. He had married a woman of intellect, but tonight he fully realized he had married a woman of profound world-changing grace. It's brilliant, he whispered, kissing her deeply. Silas would be incredibly proud. My mother would be proud. Fiona added a tear, finally escaping and tracing down her cheek. She worked so hard, Michael. She deserved to see this. She knows. Michael said, holding her tightly. She knows you won. A week later, the heavy iron gates of the estate swung open, not for a parade of Bentleys and Maybachs, but for a team of construction workers bearing a massive bronze plaque. The scandal of the century was still raging in the papers. Beatrice Blackwood and Harrison Cole were officially indicted, and Reginald Harrington was facing a decade in prison for generational fraud. But Fiona paid the tabloids no mind. She stood on the sweeping driveway dressed in her comfortable tweed coat and a warm scarf leaning against Michael's side. They watched as the workers bolted the new plaque onto the stone pillars. It read, "The Jenkins Public Library and Historical Trust. All are welcome here." Fiona smiled, taking Michael's hand. She was no longer just the archivist in the basement, and she was far more than just the Duchess of Westmoreland. She was the woman who had rewritten history, taking the greatest humiliation of her life and turning it into a legacy that would outlast them all. As they walked away from the grand estate, heading back toward the quiet, beautiful life they had built together, the sun broke through the London clouds, illuminating the bronze letters for the entire world to see. What a story of ultimate revenge and poetic justice. Fiona went from being the target of high society cruelty to the master of their total destruction, proving that intelligence and truth are the most lethal weapons of all. The elite thought they could mock a simple woman, but they forgot one crucial rule: never underestimate the person who knows your history. She didn't just take their money, she took their power and gave it back to the world. If this incredible tale of hidden royalty, brilliant strategy, and fierce karma had you hooked, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping true life dramas. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist. We want to hear from you. What would you have done in Fiona's shoes at the auction? Let us know in the comments below.